You know, there are many times when people that invite me to speak regret why they did. So let's hope this is not one of those occasions. You know, I want to start with a statistic. You know, in this world that we are trying to heal so that it serves the needs of all citizens, 300 people, individuals, own more wealth than 3 billion people. Now, is that just? Cannot. There's something systemically and structurally wrong with a world that allows that to happen. And those are the issues that we really have to come to terms with in these type of dialogues. Otherwise, we are like putting an elastoplast over a major crack that's just widening the gap between the majority of people who are living in poverty and an increasingly smaller minority of people who dominate and control and concentrate the wealth in their hands. So we know today, in whatever sector, take food as an example, we have enough food in this world to feed the 7 billion people who are hungry. Yet there's 1 billion people who will go to bed hungry today, unable to have the dignity of putting food on the table for their children. There are further 2 billion people who suffer from micronutrient deficiencies that lead to over close to 177 million children being stunted. Now, for those that understand, and I'm not a scientist, but understand the science behind this, when you are stunted, you are irreversibly damaged, mentally and physically. And this can be solved because we have the money, we have the expertise, we have the knowledge, we have the business models to solve it. We have the science to solve it. We do not have the political will. And I'm not just talking about political will in government. I'm talking about political will in you as social movements, in NGOs, in businesses, in the science, in the academia of this world. So what happens? Every day, 18,000 children die. Now what does it mean to us? Is it just a statistic? We were horrified when the World Trade Center was bombed and 3,000 people died. Can you imagine today, as we sit there, today, there will be the equivalent of 6 World Trade Centers. And we still want to debate about where we should be putting our money and our expertise and our knowledge. And that's why events like this really compel me to challenge you and to provoke you. Because if we don't deal with that dilemma, then we are fooling ourselves. And we might as well pack up our bags and go home, because we will have no impact. Because there's more than enough wealth in this world to feed the mind, the body, and the soul of humanity. But there's not enough wealth to feed the human greed of a few. And so I agreed to come and speak here for one reason. Because if one looks at the title of this, Making All Voices Count, I think it's not just a grand challenge of development, it's the core of the grand challenge of development. Because I go back to when I was young, and we lived in the dark days of apartheid. Our struggle for freedom was a struggle for voice. Because that's what apartheid stole from us. Our voice to be human beings. It stole our human dignity. So when we're talking about our struggle for freedom, we are talking about a struggle for voice. When we stood up in 1976 with millions of other South African students, we are fighting for our voice, our rights. And we were smashed. But we realized that as students, we were just fighting, and when we turned around to see who was behind us, there was no one. We were not our parents, not our communities, not the workers, not the rural areas, not the women. We were students on our own. So the system could smash us. And what it taught us was a fundamentally important lesson that we have forgotten today. That at the core of change is people. It's not us as intellectuals, as people who have knowledge, we have skills, we have money. In the equation of change, the only agent of change is the people themselves. Our challenge is to connect the science and the expertise in rooms like this to the people in those communities, working with them painstakingly around their issues, not the issues we study in textbooks, issues that affect their day-to-day lives, their bread and butter issues. So if you ask me, where did I go in the late 70s? I went to the hostels to talk to workers. At first I thought I knew what the solutions are. I discovered I knew nothing until I learned to listen to them. And from then I discovered the real wisdom that allowed us to build a mighty movement that challenged apartheid. So never forget this, because very often NGOs, powerful activists, great leaders think changes come through technology or come through holding press conferences. And that's where we kill the revolution of ideas, of morality, of ethics that we are trying to fight for. And so I think that, one of the things that we realized in those days is fighting for voice, not our voice, but the workers finding their voice, the women finding their voice, the civics finding their civic voice, the rural areas finding their rural voice. When those streams came together, we had a powerful tsunami that brought change. And what we got to ask ourselves today is, what can we use this technology, this remarkable technology revolution that we have? And I go back to 1994, and this is reflecting on what Martin said. In 1994, before we went into government, we consulted our people on what should replace apartheid. It became known as the Reconstruction and Development Program. Millions of people participated in that process. Not 80,000, millions. In face-to-face meetings, worker meetings, women's meetings, student meetings. What do you want to replace apartheid with? And we put it into a program. Unfortunately, like many of you know, and part of what we're reflecting on, is winning democracy has many dimensions. Winning political voice gave us an opportunity to go to the ballot box and put an iconic figure like Nelson Mandela as president of this country. To try to write up a constitution. At the core of that constitution was social justice and human dignity. That this democracy had to give rights and freedom and the right to what? To a better life, to quality education, to quality health, to water and sanitation, to the rights that people have a fundamental human right to. But 2 years into our democracy, we lost the plot. We buried the Reconstruction and Development Program. So what did it lead us to a conclusion of? Democracy and the formal trappings and institutions of democracy are insufficient to guarantee the rights of people. 20 years into our democracy, this is what we learned. And what do we know today? Is that 12 million South Africans will go to bed without a meal. A further 12 million South Africans are what is called food insecure. They are at risk. We know today that 1 in 4 children in our country is stunted. We know today that in 1994, the year of our democracy, more than 1 million children went to school for the first time. Or the children that were born in 1994 went to school 6 years later for the first time. And they came out in 2012. Well, let's look at the statistics of the class of 2012. Whether it's 1 million or 1.5 million, we're still trying to formalize what the actual figures were. We know that only close to 600,000 wrote the metric exams in 2012. Of that, 73% passed. And what is the pass rate? 30%. in 3 subjects and 40% in another 4 subjects. We know that the majority of those people have come into the labor market with very few skills, no jobs, and unlikely to have a job in their lifetime. 500,000, at the minimum, have disappeared. Where are they? They're not wiped off the map. They sit in our country. They sit in our townships, in our slums, and they are restless, and they're angry, and they're frustrated. Because while we as the middle classes can enjoy these wonderful ivory towers, they have nothing. That is a challenge that faces us in this country, and it's a challenge that faces us across the whole world, basically. So, if one looks at what money has been put into education in this country, in 2012, the Minister of Finance appropriates 207 billion rand, a bigger budget than the total budgets of most African countries. Yet our outcomes of education are worse than most African countries. And what Equal Education, the organization that organizes students that I respect, has said, is that only 8% of the schools have libraries. There are 3,600 schools without electricity. Can you imagine learning in a place with no electricity? There are 2,400 schools without water or sanitation. Can you imagine spending a whole day and you cannot go to the toilet, and you cannot drink water? So, those are the real challenges that face us. If you look at what happened in terms of the Eastern Cape, what happened in the Eastern Cape recently is that the government investigates that 800 million rand has been stolen by state officials. And what's happened? Babies have died because there are no incubators, there are no generators. We cannot buy the vaccines that are necessary. We cannot employ the doctors and the nurses. No one has gone to jail. So, what do? We have to go back to the people. The fact of the matter is that no country in the world is run by Facebook or Twitter. Don't fool yourselves that the social media is going to create the revolution of values that we need. It's actually going down to the people and explaining to them what their rights are, equipping them with the right tools, and making sure they fight their own battles. We're not going to fight and win their battles. They are going to fight and win their battles. And so, I was really happy that organizations like the Treatment Action Committee, Section 27, the union like DENOSA representing nurses, were part of a coalition saying, this is wrong. They are the key. We must see, in whatever we want to do about making voices work, is we strengthen that, not create more NGOs and more employment. And we sit in places like this and think we're doing a hell of a lot of good work. So I think that's the focus. When I was General Secretary of COSATU, we created NGOs. They fed off us like the mothership. They didn't tell us what our strategy should be, what technology uses we should apply. We knew what we wanted to do. They had to fit into our program as social movements. And this is the notion you've got to get to understand, that I can't understand why people have forgotten this lesson of the 80s here today. Because the 80s was about how NGOs supported communities and social movements, not the other way around. So I look back and I look at it. The important thing about how we bring change is how we give agency and voice to local communities and give them the tools that they need to follow the money. So if we could take this 207 billion rand and reduce it to what is spent on the schools, we wouldn't have had a Limpopo textbook scandal. If the parents, the students, the principal, the community knew that this school had X budget of so many million rand, that had to buy so many textbooks, so many desks, employ so many teachers. And that did not happen. Now, how can we harness this technology? Because, I go back to the sort of mid-90s when I was Minister of Communications. And I made a lot of mistakes there. But one of the things that we did right is that when we met as African ministers of communication, and we, in sub-Saharan Africa, saw that we had 600,000 telephones, mobile phones at that point. And that was less than the city of, not even the city, the suburb of Manhattan in New York. And we said that if we go and demand more money to put in mobile telephony, well, we were last in the queue of our finance ministers, because there were more important competing priorities. There were clinics and schools and houses and water and electricity. But we also saw that the private sector could drive this investment as it was doing in other parts of the world. What we had to do was create the environment, the policy, the regulatory environment, harmonize the spectrum, create opportunities for regional integration and regional operations, and find a way to attract that investment. Today, we are the fastest growing market in Africa, over 750 million cell phones. It's created a pervasive technological platform that actually not one $8 contributed. Obviously, as governments, we imposed universal obligations that got the private sector to do the right thing. And out of that came the public innovation. Things that changed the game of communications, like a prepaid card. Now what we're looking for is, what are the game changers now? You know, looking at it now, almost 20 years later, that this platform has created, as Martin has said, some incredible innovation around public innovation. M-Pesa, Ushahidi, the follow the money site that has been focused on making government expenditure transparent. There are innumerable applications that I have been exposed to now. And what is interesting is they're done by entrepreneurs mainly. And if you start to look at the impact of technology, it has fundamentally changed the way we organize our societies, the way we work, the way we access information, the way we communicate with each other, educate each other. And so suddenly we have today this generation, you, being the most connected in the world. What's missing? And you know, signing a little petition online has absolutely zero impact on us. Or maybe it has for people who are employed to keep these global websites working. But you know, I don't really see as much sense in signing a petition online if it's so disconnected from people who are fighting the battles on the ground. So I think that today we have certain tools that are fundamentally revolutionary. And when I spoke to several hundred young people in Geneva recently at the Open Knowledge Foundation meeting, I challenged them. I said, technology without, at its core, the issue of values, of dignity, of justice, is irrelevant to us. Is irrelevant to the majority of people who are facing growing poverty and inequality. But imagine how exciting it would be if hundreds and thousands and millions of young people who are so technologically savvy today could help us create a revolution of ethics in business. And it's not just in government, in business. Because in this country we know today that there are as corrupt people in business as they are in government. Look at the bread scandal. Look at the bread scandal. The fundamental challenge that we had of the most staple food of the majority of people, companies were colluding on them. Look at what's happening in the union movement or in NGOs, the corruption that we see there. So when we're tracking corruption, let's be absolutely clear. Anyone who's corrupt crosses that line, and we should hold them to account. And there should be a jury that holds them to account, and that's an aware population. So that's what I think will be where we want to go with this conversation. And so we see increasingly now, as supporting a whole range of social movements, there's a shrinking space for civil society or for individual citizenry. See it in our own country, the secrecy laws, which tries to prevent the type of transparency we want to see in government expenditure, that tries to restrict our ability, particularly of whistleblowers who want to expose corruption in our society. Look at across the world, the spying that is taking place on individual citizens. So while the technologies are opening up a whole revolution of transparency, there are other people trying to clamp down on it. So there's a contradiction that emerges, and in this, it has to be about the clash of values. What stands at the center of the world we want to see? Even today, in the discussion of the post-MPT framework, what's being discussed is how do we keep it purely technical? Find a vaccine to stop malaria, which is tremendous if we do. But it doesn't want to talk about justice. It doesn't want to talk about human rights. It doesn't want to talk about dignity and real democracy. And so I think that we have to go back to those issues. And I think that if we are able to now use what is created as these smart partnerships, and there are times when we will work with government, because there are people in government that want to do the right thing. There are times when we will fight with government. You know, we have a Minister of Health who is an extraordinary person, deeply committed to the same things that I am committed to. So when we fight a battle in the Eastern Cape, we are strengthening his hand to take on those predatory elites that steal from the public office. So in trying to work and go forward, let's understand that the outcomes that we want is better governance, is better businesses, is better civil society. Governments are the elephant in our room. And I work with many big foundations around the world, and I always ask them, try to be a bit humble. This is one of the great absence, humility. Have some humility. Because if I take the education budget in this country, even at the current exchange rate, we spend over $20 billion on education. Help us make our government spend that money in a better way. We cannot create parallel systems. We cannot say that your money is ever going to help us solve our problem here. Our problem is to make our governments do what we elect them to do. I think that at the end of the day is the goal, to make citizens aware, informed, and having the tools to hold their leaders accountable. Whether those are leaders in government, leaders in business, leaders in unions, or leaders in civil society. And that is my hope, that you emerge out of a conference like this with those type of applications that make sense, not to us sitting in this room, but make sense to those people that are at the coalface of a struggle for human dignity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jay, for that rousing call to action.